Hey gang, this project was a long time coming. It took me probably a couple of months to finish, mostly because I was working on it on weekends, go figure. There's a little bit of something for everybody in it. I made shelves, I made a bench, I made some shoe organizers, which I guess would also be considered shelves. I painted, I sanded, I stained, I drilled, I glued, I cut dados, I used screws. It runs the gambit of woodworking things that you can do. Well, with that, I'm going to get started on the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, share it with your friends, and of course, comment down below. Say something mean, say something funny, or just say something random. It's all good.
Alright, so this is what we're working with. It's not a very big space, but we can definitely organize it better than it is right now. So let's get started.
Just going to use my handy dandy trim puller to pull off the trim in the working area. I had a hard time figuring out how I was going to space my bench, so I just taped it out on the floor. The tricky part was that floor register that I had to work around. Can't really cover that up. The first thing I'm going to make is a shoe organizer. This is going to stand about 8 feet tall, and it's going to have 24 slots in it. And as you can see, I'm using my handy dado jig that I made in a previous video. In fact, I made that jig specifically for making this shoe organizer. In case you're wondering, that formula can holds my life savings in small denominations like quarters, nickels, dimes, and pennies. I needed to cut 48 dados on 4 different pieces of wood, making sure that they were all spaced the same way, hence the dado jig. Next, I cut a 1/4 inch dado for a piece of plywood for the back before trimming all of the pieces to their proper length. After that, I was ready to start cutting the slats. There were a lot of them. I made the side pieces out of 3/4 inch plywood, the slats out of 1/2 inch plywood, and the back out of 1/4 inch plywood, for anyone who's wondering. For the sake of time, I tried not to put too many sanding clips in this video. Sometimes you need a few practice pocket holes before you get it right. Just don't practice on your working piece. I should have cut a couple more dados for the top and bottom. Oh well, live and learn. To help with spacing, I dry fit a couple of the slats while I put in the top and bottom plate on my shoe organizer. Once that was done, I could start installing the slats, and oh boy was there a lot of them. It got a little too cold in my garage for the glue to take, and for some strange reason I forgot that I own sawhorses, so I'm doing this on a couple of kids' blocks. It gets the job done. The back slid in perfectly without any adjustments, as far as you know. I still have to make a bench and some upper shelves. This was quite the project. Now that the shoe organizers are assembled, I can put them in place and base the measurements for the rest of my built-ins off of those. The pieces I'm cutting now are the legs or the sides of the bench, and then the longer, narrower pieces tie the whole bench together. What do you guys think of my new apron? I'm a big fan. It keeps the sawdust off of me, and it helps me keep track of my tools a little bit better. But I'm still trying to figure out what tools to keep in it, so if you've got any good ideas, comment below. I got almost all of the pocket holes right this time. Big win. Time for assembly, which means back down to the basement because it was too cold in my garage for the glue to take. I'll also add that my children's train table made a very poor workbench. Eventually, I do remember that I have sawhorses, but until then, enjoy this shot of the floor. It's hip to be a square. There you have it. Highly functional, but not very cute, which is too bad because I am a big fan of cute. This was sort of a mistake and sort of on purpose. I wish I had a better explanation than that, but I don't. Just know that the bench is L-shaped, and that is the connection point between the long part of the L and the short part of the L. With the bench just about finished, it's time to start working on the upper shelves, which are also L-shaped if you didn't figure that out already. This will be fairly similar to the shoe organizer. I'm cutting some 1/4-inch dados for the back and some 1/2-inch dados for the slats. I designed this to have an upper and a lower shelf, so there's a top, a middle, and a bottom. For that reason, the middle pieces will have dados on the top and bottom of the shelf, and they will need to be a little bit more shallow just to maintain the integrity of the board. I put that peanut can upside down on my coffee mug to keep the sawdust off of it. The innovations on my channel never cease to amaze. We must have had a heat wave because I'm finally able to do some gluing in my garage. That of course begs the question of why I'm rocking the Michael Jackson look. Some things just can't be explained. I had a hard time deciding the best way to clamp up these right angle joints. I don't think I will be recommending these little 90-degree angled clamping mechanisms to any of my friends. Maybe one of these days I'll splurge on one of those fancy Craig clamps. I really miss my mustache and all of the wacky adventures we had together. The clamps on the right work a little bit better, but I'm still on the search for the world's greatest corner clamp. To avoid even more pocket holes, I decided to glue and nail the middle shelf in. Between the back and the slats, it should be plenty sturdy without pocket holes. I used 1/4-inch plywood for the backing on all of the shelves, hence the 1/4-inch dados that I cut. Once again, the backs slid in effortlessly, at least as far as you know. Put that one in upside down. Whoops. I always like to leave room for improvement, so rather than make perfect joints, I left them a little bit off and caulked them instead. If there's no room for improvement, what's the point, right? Time for paint. I started off with Sherwin-Williams Pro Block Primer. Hey, would you look at that? I finally found my sawhorses. Once the primer was on, I went with some all-surface enamel. It's a little bit harder and more durable than some other latex paints, and I need all the durability I can get. I did 2 coats of this with my sprayer, and if I'm being honest, I don't love how it turned out. I wish I had brushed it all, but I'm sure by looking at the project that you can see it would have taken me a very, very long time to brush it all. In fact, I'd probably still be painting if I hadn't used the sprayer. I think the problem is this sprayer is more meant for textured walls and things of that nature. I can't quite seem to get the settings right so that I get a nice smooth coat. If anybody has any tips for me, I'm all ears. Time to start installing. Finally. Couple of handsome gentlemen right there. Don't worry, the top of the bench is coming. Somebody get some pants on that kid. Progress. Time for the face frames. Once again, there are plenty of them. Tight Bond is not a sponsor. Yet. Just cutting out 48 little pieces of wood for the shoe organizer. Cue nail gun montage. I tacked some of the face frames onto the shelves and bench to give myself more precise measures. Then I pulled them off and brought them back out to the garage for assembly and paint. I assembled the face frames using pocket holes and glue. That seems to be a fairly standard way of doing it. I would also strongly recommend making sure all of the pieces are flat on your working surface. It's not a lot of fun to sand them flush on the front side. I feel like somebody just mentioned how to avoid sanding the face frames flush on the front side. I should have taken better notes. For those of you hoping to learn how to make a garden trellis, pay careful attention. For the face frames, I decided to brush on the paint. That way I could go back after they were installed and make any touch-ups I needed to without having them look weird. Avoiding drips was a challenge, probably because I'm not a great painter. To avoid them as best I could, I started by painting the sides of the face frame from the back of the face frame, if that makes any sense. Then I flipped it over and painted the front, hopefully brushing out any drips that may have occurred while I was painting the sides. Ready to install. Sorry for the camera angle, this was pretty close quarters. On the plus side, everything fit quite well, which was a major relief to me. This is the first time I've done face frames like this. Normally, I just nail each piece individually to the workpiece, but with a big project like this, I thought it was better to assemble it in advance. Obviously, the mustache looks magnificent, but do you think I need a haircut? It looks like I'm getting a bit of a rat tail. Finally, I can start working on the bench top. The wall that my bench was on was not straight, not even in the least, so I had to use my jigsaw to cut it to fit. It turned out okay, but obviously I would have liked a perfect fit. I got an edge-glued piece of wood from Menards, and in order to make it look like it was cut from one big piece of wood, I lined up the grain and the way the boards were running. Technically, it was all cut from the same piece of wood, but it was cut from a long, narrow piece, not a big, wide piece. I hope that formula can is interest-bearing. I wanted to smooth over the exposed corners on my bench, but I also wanted it to look natural, so I went with 1/8 of an inch round over. Always use pre-stain, unless of course you're not staining the wood, in which case you're just doing an unnecessary step. I went with a very natural looking stain because I wanted to preserve the color of the wood, but in hindsight I probably could have just put poly on it and called it good. I applied 5 coats of satin polyurethane, sanding it between each coat. I started with a 240 grit sandpaper and worked my way up to 800, and after sanding each time I wiped off any dust that accrued on the surface. I'm quite happy with how this bench top turned out. I love the look of natural wood. To attach the top, I used a small amount of construction adhesive and then I drilled in some screws in the bottom to secure it. Gun show! Time for the coat hooks, or knobs I guess in this case. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to tune in next week to watch me pump it up. Now it's time to clean up the mess that I made during the making of this video. Got my work cut out for me.